Hi, I'm Malika Bilal. Today, a major turning point in Sudan's revolution. After months of street protests, President Omar al-Bashir's 30 years in power come to an end. So what's next? Tweet us or leave your comments in our live YouTube chat and you'll be in the stream. Thursday, Sudanese Defense Minister General Awad ibn Auf dramatically announced that Sudan's president, Omar al-Bashir, had been arrested and removed from power. Ibn Auf also declared the constitution suspended and said the country would be ruled by the military for 2 years. As the news broke, tens of thousands of people took to the streets of the capital Khartoum in jubilation.
It came too late. We have all been under his rule for 30 years and feel the step came too late. But everyone is happy now.
This revolution was achieved by the people and the army, and only those two sources.
Everyone will work for a better united Sudan. Sudan is suffering from economic hardship.
But there are those who aren't so happy by the military's action and say this is nothing more than a regime-orchestrated coup. Well, joining us to discuss this from Stafford, Virginia, is Sudanese journalist Ismail Kushkush. In Khartoum, Dalia Al-Rubi is a member of the Sudanese Congress Party. And here in our studio, Ahmed Kaduda, a PhD student at George Washington University. Welcome to the stream, everyone. It's good to have you here. Let's start with the sentiment in Sudan, summed up for many by this tweet on my laptop. This is from Raf, who says, "It's a bittersweet day. It had the potential to be the greatest day in our lives as Sudanese, but unfortunately, we are still ruled by the military. Still, there's a lot of work to be done by people at the sit-in." But then there's an aside here. He wants us to still know we are happy Bashir is gone for good. So Dalia, describe for us what that moment when the defense minister announced the, quote, toppling of the regime, unquote, what was that like for you?
I think the build-up to it was more of the story. We woke up really early in the morning thinking that we're going to hear some great news. It took 6 hours. We had the TV on, and unfortunately, we were faced with actually a U.S.-sanctioned official from 2007. He's telling us that, you know, this is transition, 2 years military regime, as if nothing that we have said for years and now for the past 6 days and for the past 4 months actually matters. And I think it angered a lot of us, and we had a lot of hope at the beginning. The streets of Khartoum was just incredible. I don't think any of us will forget these few hours. We went spontaneously. We went with so much hope. From all walks of life coming in together with the understanding that this is it. We're going to see the real change that we're standing up for. It is unfortunate what's happening, but what's important is that we've not lost our resolve. We have no intention of backing down. We hope. We don't hope. We actually know that change will happen. I'm being emotional, I know, but change will happen because I think we deserve it. And I think that the youth have spoken very clearly for all these months. It's not the time to back down. I think I think it's kind of a very what's the word? It's a very confusing time, but there is still hope. There's still a lot of determination. I think that this statement, the announcement, was caused a lot of determination.
Right.
The more they kind of push back, the more we're actually pushing forward and insisting that we will be going forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's very inspirational to see, especially the youth who have been born actually after the NCP came, and to see them so inspirationally leading the way and showing us that they're willing to fight all the way for change, peacefully fight for change. Right. It was an inspiration, definitely.
And the NCP being the ruling party there. You spoke about the youth, and I'd actually like to hear from one of those youth who's actually still there in the sit-in. As we speak, she sent us an audio comment on why she's there and how she's feeling. And I think what you were talking about is some of those emotions, the hope and the anger, is represented in her comment. Have a listen.
Good evening. This is Amna Ibrahim from Sudan, Khartoum, reporting from the sit-in in front of the General Command of the armed forces headquarters. We're still here. We're still angry. We're still frustrated. We're not happy. We're not satisfied with the outcome of the what we could only call a recycling of the same regime that we've taken out to the streets against, and we will be here until we get our demands.
And the committees on the ground are urging activists to steer away from being too noticeable, which is why you didn't see her face in that comment there. But Ahmed, talk to us about the emotions that you just heard from Dalia and you heard from the protester there at the sit-in, that kind of roller coaster ride.
I think there's a lot of highs and lows. People anticipated a total transformation because the demands have been very clear from the beginning. People had said that we want the regime to collapse. We don't want an alternative that is a facelift to the regime. And unfortunately, the announcement itself, what it showed us is that the regime was so strategic in basically recreating itself. Ibn Auf announced the 4 major elements of the regime, or the pillars of support, which are the military, the NIS with its current head, the police, and the rapid support forces, the RSF. This is a militia Bashir created in the wake of the Darfur conflict or genocide to support his regime. Now, these 4 pillars basically are still in power, but without the facade, which is the few individuals that were arrested. I think there were a couple of things that many people were expecting. For example, the movement that actually spearheaded this transformation, the Sudan Professionals Association, was completely sidelined and ignored by the military. This was the movement that actually forced the military to make this move.
Were you expecting what, like a nod to them? That
Absolutely.
This statement would acknowledge them?
Absolutely. People expected that this movement that brought us here needs to be a part of this moment, and they weren't, which was a huge disappointment. And I think that at this stage, people are not going to accept anything short of a full inclusion of the civilian opposition parties. There are the signatories to the Freedom and Change Charter, which was written by the professionals and signed by the vast majority of the civilian and some of the armed opposition groups, in fact. And they unified behind this movement. Unfortunately, they're not playing a role at this stage, which is very disappointing.
So before we go too much further, Ismail, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about this Minister of Defense. We have this tweet from Mo Saifuddin, a former stream guest and a member of the diaspora. He says, this is a symptom of larger issues, lack of strong institutions and political acumen. This is a bad remix to the Bashir regime and an insult to the Sudanese people. The defense minister was handpicked by al-Bashir after the revolution began, and he's an alleged war criminal. So what do we know about General Awad ibn Auf, Ismail?
He's been a long-time member of the military and of the government. He was an ambassador also, I believe, in Oman for some time. He's one of part of Bashir's close circle of allies, and that's why he was brought in initially after the Bashir's February speech to be closer within his circles as his assistant. So, I mean, he was handpicked in the anticipation, I believe, from Bashir for changes that were coming. And, you know, this seems to be just a reshuffle, a rearrangement of heads in the government rather than any genuine transformation or acknowledgement of the necessity of transition into something new.
So I wanted to share this because there's so many tweets on him and what this means. Khalid here writes, changing faces doesn't change the character of a regime. And so nothing better to sum that up than this GIF that is circulating online. This is Ola Diab who tweeted it. The resemblance is impeccable physically and figuratively. So slight tongue-in-cheek there. But it is a GIF that is transposing Omar al-Bashir's photo with General Awad ibn Auf's photo. And you can see what people online feel about this. Did that surprise you at all, Dalia, the fact that this is what happened? That this is what is replacing Omar al-Bashir?
I think that the element of surprise was more related to how much disregard they had towards the awareness and the political knowledge of the people in the streets today. As Ahmed and Ismail pointed out, I mean, the history of the forces that are being part of the transition, as well as Awad himself. A lot of people know about it, and a lot of people have no expectation to follow it. But I kind of wanted to go back to what Ahmed was saying, related to the sorry, I keep forgetting, Ahmed, related to the declaration. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So related to the declaration, I would kind of slightly disagree that there hasn't been enough that's been done. The declaration, the forces, the signatories of the declaration, went in on the 8th of April with their statement asking for 5 specific things. Number one is obviously the toppling of the regime of Omar al-Bashir, as well as the other points. This statement was read out in the sit-in first day, or the 8th and the 9th, as well as today. And people got a lot of, they recognized it, they've heard it, and they've supported it. And today they actually did a very clear call for people not to go home and the sit-in to continue until the transition actually happens. And I think it's very important for us to point out that there is an actual umbrella or a collective body with the professional association in it, but as well as as Ahmed said, the Sudan call and Civil Society Alliance and others, the National Professional Union as well. The conversation has been always kind of undermining the strength of this umbrella and how much more clarity that we actually have on transition. And I don't think people are recognizing that there is a lot of work that's been done for the past few months, and now there are clear plans and way forward for civilian engagement and actual transition that does not have to involve this extremely militant process for 2 years. There's definitely room for that. This alliance or these forces have the position to speak internationally and regionally to governments, as well as to the military transition.
Yeah, just to reiterate, the point I was trying to make is that the military itself did not take these forces into account. Dali is absolutely right. These actors played a very central role. They helped mobilize people, they helped organize people, they helped people get on the streets and vocalize their demands. But the military ignored that completely. I mean, more or less, it said that we're going to take over the state, we're going to dissolve the government, arrest a few folks, and hold on to power for 2 years. That is not something that the signatories for the Freedom and Change Charter are calling for. And they're not accepting it, as Dalia said very accurately. They're not going to go away. They're going to continue the protests and hopefully be able to materialize some sort of real change. Because I think what we risk is a situation similar to that of Egypt after 2011, where the people came out on the streets, there was real mobilization, but the military basically co-opted that, created this sort of transitional period, and was able to recreate the regime. And that's a fear that we really worry about.
Ismail?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something also I think that's important to point to. The protesters had high hopes in the army as a historical national institution that would intervene on their sides. That perception, I think, is a little bit naive. It may be true for the junior officers, for the middle-range officers, but Bashir has been a part of the army for a very long time, and he knows the army very well. And he is a shrewd politician. I think it is a mistake to underestimate how his shrewdness, his ability to build alliances. I mean, he has survived for 30 years, and that's not an easy task. Yeah. It isn't that surprising, I think, to see the way things are going. This is a high mountain to climb, so to speak.
Right.
So that the army would have intervened on behalf of the people, I think, really needs to be reassessed. I think it will take more than just protests and Khartoum. Again, this is a government that has been in power for a very long time. It has its interests. The army has its interests. The entire security apparatus has entrenched interest in the state economically, and so forth, and like Egypt. So I think it's going to take more than the protests that we've seen. It's going to be a longer battle.
I wouldn't say that it's, I totally agree with you, Ismail, but I think there was a very clear position from these actors saying, we don't want you to replace Bashir, we want you to remove Bashir and lay the groundwork for a transitional process. And I think that's what you're alluding to, Ismail. But there's something else. I think the point that most people kind of overlook is that the military, for the past several decades, has been the regime, right? So when we talk about, changing the regime, we're actually asking a central pillar of the regime to actually create a transformation in which it's going to remove itself from a center of power. And that's very difficult. And I think that's what Ismail was alluding to. And it's very dangerous. One other point I want to add is that historically in Sudan, there have been 4 coups prior to this one. Every coup was very seamless for the simple fact that when the military spoke, things were final. In fact, when the defense minister spoke, things were final. But what did we see today? We saw a 6-hour delay in which there were a lot of, people weren't aware of what's happening. And the result, or the announcement, showed us that basically it was obvious that the military had to get the okay of the NIS, the okay of the RSF, and other security apparatuses. And that is where Bashir, and Ismail was talking about this, he was so strategic in making sure that there's a balance of power between those who have the monopoly over violence, right? Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, he's actually in a much safer position today than he would have been if there wasn't this change in the structure of the regime.
So I think that is a fascinating point. And Dalia, I hear you trying to get in. I wanted to bring up a couple of tweets from our viewers, though, because you all have mentioned several things that are making our viewers go, this sounds familiar. So we have several people from Zimbabwe chiming in. This is just one. This is Niba, who says, the Sudanese people need to learn from what happened in Zimbabwe and make sure the entire regime is going out for good. The military need to protect the people during this transition moment, not take over power. There must be a change in the regime to bring about change. We also have several tweets from Egypt and other places around the world of people trying to give some advice to the Sudanese protesters. But Dalia, what did you want to add?
I kind of wanted to go back to the point that Ismail made about the expectation towards the military. I think that, and this is a conversation I've been having throughout the day with a lot of people who are kind of a bit demoralized about the news and announcement. Prior to the past 6 days, we had no expectation of protection or of any sort of responsible behavior towards us as protesters. And in these 6 days, on the contrary, we're actually quite afraid of all uniformed and ununiformed militias, including the army itself. And the past 6 days, I wouldn't say it's staged, but it could be staged. These images of the army helping us and protecting us has been problematic because it's kind of changed people's expectation of something that we've endured for 30 years, which is they're not here to protect us. Even if individuals were doing that out of even inspiration, we can't expect so much out of a military that has systematically killed us and been violent and brutal towards us. And I think, as Ismail pointed out, it is kind of a naive expectation to say that these 6 days are going to somehow delete this trail of the harm that they've done. And as I say to all the protesters that I spoke to today, is that, just delete the 6 days and the expectation that you have and go back to the same fear you had, not fear, but the same expectation that you had 6 days ago, which is that there is no one out there of this regime that will actually help us or protect us. And they had the same commitment 6 days ago. On the contrary, it was even scarier because there were less numbers and they were less, there was a lot of numbers, but not as much as the past 6 days. And I think that we have to be very harsh with ourselves and very honest with the fact that we are actually not in this with the military. There are no good guys in that mix. And I know it might be a cynical picture, but this is, I think, what's happening, and we have to realize the history of these people.
And I hear people online saying, actually, it's realistic. You mentioned the expectations of a few days ago, so I want to take our viewers back just a few days, really. So much has happened to this photo. This is one that was circulated very widely. It was taken by a photographer, Lana Haroun, and you can see a woman on top of a car, and this woman actually is 22-year-old student Ala Saleh. Take a look at what these protests looked like just a few days ago. So in the background, they are chanting Thawra or revolution. Ala, the woman in that photo, tweeted this. She said, Sudanese women have always participated in revolutions in this country. If you see Sudan's history, all our queens have led the state. It's part of our heritage. I'm very proud to take part in this revolution, and I'm glad our revolution has achieved its first goal. Al-Bashir resigns. But Ismail, of course, as Ahmed mentioned, this has happened before. This is not the first popular uprising. So based on history, what do we know of history that tells us what should happen next, Ismail?
Right. I mean, that's the important and bigger question. I mean, Sudan has been in a cycle of civilian and military government since 1956. This is not the first time. The first uprising against the military government in 1964 in the region, and again in 1985. I think the question that should be in the back the heads of organizers is if Sudan comes out of this into a genuine civilian government, how can politicians, how can activists avoid the same mistakes that were made in 64 and 1985? I think that's the bigger question. There's been this cycle of failure. One Sudanese author called, addiction to failure. I think that's something that we also need to keep in mind. I mean, the road is long. It's not just getting rid of Bashir. It's not just getting rid of the military. It's creating a genuine political culture that allows for the exchange of ideas, for the peaceful exchange of powers, where all Sudanese of different backgrounds can contribute in building their country.
Ahmed?
I'd like to kind of respond to this with Ismail. I think that there's a lot of, there's similarity to our two previous intifadas, but I think there are some factors.
An intifada
in this
being
case
uprising for those who don't speak Arabic in our community. That's okay. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So I think what I've spoken to a few people with the armed rebel groups, it's obviously live, but anyway, the armed rebel groups, that one of the things that they were saying is that this change this time is that the participation of these groups from the beginning, as opposed to the last two intifadas, which it was kind of, let's get the revolution going, finish it, and let's sit on the table and discuss peace and ending of war. And I think this time it's very different from day one that these groups are part of this process. And it's definitely at the agenda as the number one priority in the transition period for the war issue. And I think in the past two, there has been challenges because of that, because obviously development will not happen without peace, and peace is at the forefront of this revolution. And I'm hopeful that this will actually make it a much stronger process for the future and more long-lasting. I think the representation of our groups is an added value.
Right. Dalia, Ismail.
Difference.
Ismail, I'm so sorry. Ahmed, I'm so sorry. And Dalia, because there is so much more to discuss. More than 30 years in power for Omar al-Bashir. And of course, there's only one show that we can do today. But this conversation will continue online. #AJStream. I want to end with this tweet from Basic Sosa, who says, "We will continue to protest until this regime ends once and for all. It's hard, but we will do it. Enough is enough." That's all the time we have. We'll see you online.